Welcome, everyone. So I'm Julian David. I'm the CEO here at techUK. We are the Digital Trade Association for the UK. Chips to clicks, as we put it, including companies using those things to do really interesting and fantastic things, more of which we'll find out soon. So this is the first of our fireside chats, although there's no fire, but imagine a fire. Should get one projected, shouldn't we? Something like that. And I'm actually delighted to kick the series off by welcoming Greg Jackson, CEO and founder of Octopus Energy, as my first guest. And Greg's company is a member of techUK and a tech pioneer, and we're going to be looking over our shoulder for a start to make sure Constantine is not here. Those of you who didn't get that reference, look up Keir Starmer and Constantine the Octopus, and you'll see.
We're entirely innocent.
Yes, always. But we're going to take a look at Octopus's journey, Greg, because obviously you're the founder, so no one better to talk to you about that. Since creation 2015. Have a look at 2023, sort of near future. And I'm also going to see if I can, get into picking your brains about, okay, well, what about tech? Because there's a lot of talk about tech, new innovations in tech. But how does that actually drive forward something really important like green and clean tech? So we got a lot to cover in an hour. We are going to hopefully stop and give you guys a chance to ask one or two questions at the end. And then right at the end, there will be some drinks outside. This is not a confidential discussion. It's not the Chatham House rule. You do come in, grab a seat, grab the seat. There's only one left, I think. Anyone else is going to have to stand, but standing room only is good. And we've got a lot of people online as well. And it is, we do welcome you tweeting about this. And I think the topics we're going to talk about are important to us in the industry. So maybe we can keep the dialogue going as well. And I think you probably welcome that, Greg. So welcome. Let me maybe kick off with a question. So I think you said when you started, Greg, that you wanted to use technology to drive change. I remember going to one of the sessions really early on when the company was getting going. Given the journey you're on, are you actually an energy company that's using technology or a technology company that's delivering energy?
Yeah. Hello, everyone, by the way. Hello, everyone. I think it was like yin and yang, really. We've built a technology platform, Kraken, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, which is really designed to bring energy into the 21st century, or whatever we are now, mid-2020s. And at the same time, built an energy company that utilizes Kraken to show what's possible. And I think they both feed each other brilliantly, because controlling the technology allows us to drive a pace of innovation, to test ideas without having to go through long drawn-out negotiations with providers or putting together sort of responses for a proposal and then not doing things too expensive. And similarly, I think for a tech company to be able to have direct access to a huge consumer base in the market, to be able to say, hey, look, the tech can do some magical things, and not have to persuade clients and licensees, but to just do it. And so they really feed each other. Now, as we built the business, we license our technology to other companies. And essentially, this acts as a sort of a machine that turbocharges their ability to innovate, because as a tech platform provider, we can test ideas at pace, and then clients get access to that very, very quickly. And I think that enables them to accelerate away from their rivals by benefiting from this turbocharged development.
And so give us an example, Greg, of something where you've done something like that, and been the first to bring that into the energy marketplace.
So fundamentally underlying everything we do is a belief that, well, we understand the economics and the physics. A renewable energy world is cheaper than a fossil fuel world, but only if we use renewables right. There's a sort of most of the people that grew up in energy are used to a world in which you turn on a power station, you get a rectangle of power, and you've got a very predictable demand curve. So you just turn on rectangles, stack them up, that's your demand met. But in a renewable world, essentially you've got these kind of big zigzags of power availability, wind's on and off, and solar doesn't happen at night, and so on. At the points when it's windy and sunny, and with other technologies, for example, hydro, when that energy source is abundant, it's the cheapest power we've ever had, and it's getting cheaper every year. So the magic is making sure we use it at those times. The beautiful thing is, exactly the same time as we're revolutionizing how we generate power, we're also revolutionizing how we use it. So an electric car battery carries enough power for a typical house for the best part of a week. Plugging in an electric car is the equivalent of turning on 1,000 light bulbs. So when you've got kind of grid operators around the world that kind of think their job is to keep the lights on, keeping the lights on is pretty easy, but handling the load of electric cars or, for example, a load of electric heat pumps would be challenging if we don't change the way in which demand and supply join up. But if we do change it, instead of worrying about the fact an electric car is such a big load, we can instead embrace the fact it's got this massive, great battery, and it's quite happy to be charged at 7 p.m. or 7 a.m. or at midnight. Or indeed, for most people, the average UK commute is 9 miles. A typical electric car battery might have a couple of hundred miles of range. So the car's happy to be charged on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. As long as it's got the power when you need it, we've got enormous flexibility now. And when we soak up the power, and we can soak it up when it's cheap. The more of that we do, the less we need to worry about the times it's not windy and sunny. Now, of course, that's not to say they're not a problem, but the problem is dramatically smaller if we run the system intelligently. And a great example of this in action, we started kind of doing a lot of this stuff 4 or 5 years ago, and really demonstrating that, whether it be charging an electric car automatically at times that suit power but meet the need of the owner, or indeed things that where people think about it, and you literally just reward them for doing the dishwasher at a different time. And as we went into the energy crisis, National Grid kind of spotted this and started talking to us maybe a year ago about, could this be used to help balance the system at times that gas is tight and incredibly expensive? Or indeed, could it even help reduce the risk of power cuts? And that's why certainly anyone in the UK will have seen media a lot a few weeks ago and again this week about people being rewarded to move their consumption. Now, because we've done a lot, we built our platform, our communications, and our understanding of consumers around these kind of ideas. There are 26 energy companies that are part of this National Grid stuff. Octopus was the first, but I think the National Grid say 1 million households are signed up to it. 600,000 of those are Octopus. So Octopus alone has more customers signed up than 25 other companies added together. But the impact, and that's not to boast about it, but it's to say that fundamentally, if you think about the world differently, you build things differently, from the way in which you relate to a consumer from the beginning, it's the way you build the tech and the ability to deploy the entire customer experience in this world. And it's harder to play catch up than it is to create. And so, on Monday this week, 420,000 Octopus customers shifted their demand by an hour. And that was the equivalent of turning off all of the power in Glasgow, just among Octopus customers. Now, the ability to do that fundamentally changes our ability as a species, as a nation, as a society, to move into a renewable world. And it demonstrates, people have got appetite for it, just the way that my mum will buy sausages for 50p off. So people will shift their power to save 50p or £1 or whatever. It's the same mindset, but it's fundamental, because if you look at the sort of linear thinkers that sort of, if you want a better term, sort of dinosaurs of the energy industry, they've just assumed that consumers would never do this. And therefore, they've assumed that the move to renewables will be more expensive and harder than it will be. Now, that's just one example. I mean, when it comes to automatically charging electric cars, managing heat pumps, kind of optimizing domestic solar, battery, everything else, the possibilities are endless. And so just one, I use that one because that's an example where you lead the way and then the system catches up. But one that I'm incredibly excited about right now, forgive me for this, I don't know if it's really relevant. But anyway, fuck it, it's brilliant. I think it's been very familiar to people in tech. We have started collaborating initially with an innovative house builder. So house building has often been seen as a sort of, a world free of tech. But there are these modular house builders, literally building the components for a house in a factory, they ship it to site and assembling it very, very quickly. There was one that I met who, they build student accommodation. And when they ship the components from the factory, they've already got the salt and pepper pots in the cupboards before they assemble the house. I mean, it's incredible. But we started talking to one of them about some of this stuff. And collectively, we came with this observation that we thought we could build a house that would never have an energy bill. And we've done it. And we launched the first 2 houses in August of 2022. And they've got heat pumps, solar panels, a battery, and a smart hot water heater. Our tech optimizes it all. And the on-cost in building means it will pay for itself in maybe 3 or 4 years at today's energy prices, maybe 7 or 8 in normal times. But the household will never have an energy bill. There's no gas supply, so it's a fantastic carbon story. And it's an example of the ways in which innovative companies in non-innovative sectors, by getting together, can drive radical change. And I said we did the first 2 in August. I was told earlier we've just done the 164th. So that's an 82x increase in 5 months. I'm not saying we'll keep that forever, but the reality is we think it's perfectly possible. At techUK, there's about 400,000 new homes a year. 100, 200,000 of them could be made zero bills now. And so this is how revolutions happen.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to say personally, this is, I remember coming to hear you very early on, 2016 or something like that. Correct. And it was shortly after I'd actually done a pitch at the utilities conference. The Trade Association of Utilities got all of them together. And I remember somebody there complaining about their customers not switching to smart meters. So I said, well, what are you doing what's the benefit to them? What are you actually doing for them if they do this? And that's just such a great example of a platform where they do something which allows you to do something for them, which then means that they're more likely to do something which is good for everybody, et cetera, et cetera. So really interesting. You talked about the platform and you were able to build it from scratch.
Yeah.
It's obviously working very well, but what are you looking at next? I mean, has that platform got everything it needs, or are you looking, to put more things in it? And how does that fit into, take your modular home idea? What else would you want to do?
Well, so speaking about the platform, it's worth saying the origin of the business was I and one of my co-founders previously built a business that built. Essentially, we ended up building enterprise software, helping large enterprises through the digital revolution. Our biggest client was SAP, and we had an awful lot of experience of working with companies wrestling their way into the digital era. And one observation was transformation for a large enterprise it's like open heart surgery. You open up the very innards of the system and trying to replumb everything while keeping it alive. It's really hard. And I think that's why so many companies end up on, very long, drawn out, hugely expensive transformations that never deliver. And on top of that, very often, chief executives lose their job. There was one case of a UK FTSE 100 company that wasn't able to send out invoices for months on end. So these are difficult processes. And so what we set out to do was say, look, if you were building a platform from scratch, how would you use it to create the kind of agility that you might expect in a typical tech startup like, say, Uber? And so, one thing is we built the entire stack. So our platform, Kraken, goes all the way from, look, if you're not into energy, this may not make it, but as a general tech abstract thought, it goes all the way from interfacing with the metering system and electricity generation and controlling wind farms and solar farms and things like that, all the way to issuing the bills to a consumer, even doing the telephony and messaging. That holisticity means that you have a single data base in the middle. And that enables you to do stuff at a pace that is unimaginable in a traditional enterprise, but absolutely natural in a modern enterprise. So, for example, you immediately see that if you've sent a particular email to someone, they're more likely to have called, and that's because their smart meter wasn't working, and that's because they signed up. All that's in one place, and it's just immediately apparent. You can run machine learning and all kinds of algorithms over the data in real time, rather than having to wait for things to synchronize. It just transforms the way you operate a business. And so when we talked about migrating for clients, one observation was, instead of open heart surgery, we build a baby. So it's got all of the functions, but no customers and no staff. And then we start moving customers and staff over, and the baby grows and the existing business shrinks, but you'd never have open heart surgery. By the way, the inspiration for that was Shopify. I helped some people set up an e-commerce business in the mid-2010s, I guess. And they were about to embark on a huge process of building and specifying and creating a complex infrastructure. And just before we kind of signed the deal, I thought, I should try Shopify, actually. I was like, fucking hell. Like, literally, it's basically got everything you need. Just fill it up with products, put a design on it. Magic. Now, of course, from there, you'll develop your business. You'll be plugging apps in and things like that. But the core of it was just there. And we took something that would have cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, and we were able to do it for hundreds of pounds. Something that would take 6 months and do it in 6 days. By the way, we ended up using BigCommerce. Just to say, in case everyone checks back, Shopify, BigCommerce, both excellent platforms. But that was the insight. And we were like, well, that's what we're building for utilities. So in a way, Kraken is like Shopify for utility. And it can act as the core for everything. And that's what unleashes the agility that enables you to sort of, back to that utility question, to say to utility, instead of having 150 people in a marketing department, each doing a little bit of the process and asking for data extracts, they've just got access to the system, to the user experience, and they can act immediately. So they can turbocharge their pace. Instead of seeing a customer as a problem, or worrying about trying to ram a smart meter down someone's throat, they can create really magical experiences built around the smart meter that make people want them.
Yeah, I'm really interested in so you build a platform. The classic approach then is to go and try and sell that platform to existing players in an industry, isn't it? But you didn't do that. You actually said, well, we're also going to build an energy company.
Yeah.
What prompted that? Was it that you had to show these, let's call them dinosaurs, that it's possible to use this stuff in this way?
Yeah.
Or was it simply that you also thought, well, I've got this thing and I can do some good and some other stuff, and I can move the green agenda myself? Which of the motivations was it?
Are you married?
Yes.
What was the reason you chose the spouse you did?
Trial and error.
All right, cool. Number one. No, please tweet.
If at first you don't succeed.
Yeah, well, but it's all those things, right? And I think the reality, the reason I said that is just, I think good ideas. I'm assuming it was a good decision.
Yes,
we should talk about that later, maybe not. Don't tweet this bit.
This one was.
Yeah, exactly. Snap. Anyway, so where were we? Yeah, so good ideas have many kind of, you arrive at it multiple times. And so for us, first of all, when we did speak to large energy companies, and they said it's too difficult. People tried to build platforms before, it's too complex. They said, look, we're really efficient. We're already at scale. The tech can't benefit us, right? They said, look, customers don't care about energy. They just want to switch the lights on, right? Energy brands should just disappear in the background. They don't really exist. We send out a bill, we get paid, job done.
Yeah.
And so there were a whole pile of conversations we had that were like, we didn't agree with the answer. And so the only way to both test our ideas and, if we were right, demonstrate them, was to do it ourselves. And so it's, Octopus Energy today is a huge enterprise I'm incredibly proud of. Even during the energy crisis, in fact, thank God, during the energy crisis, I think we've done a lot of good.
Yeah.
Although the crisis is bigger than any company can deal with. But it really was kind of the demo client for Kraken. And the opportunity to try and drive change at scale. By the way, it's not just, for example, the existing companies. By the way, and there's no criticism for the attitudes that they have, because until you've tried it, you don't know. But and it's right that energy companies are risk averse. They handle colossal sums of money, and fairly critical infrastructure. So there's a risk aversion that it kind of required this demonstration. But I think regulators and governments and regulated parts of the sector, like grids, all needed to see that this can work. Yeah. Because otherwise the myth was beginning to take hold that the energy transition would put costs up, that we couldn't afford to go green. Now, of course, on a long-term basis, we all know we can't afford not to. But for as long as you can kick it down the road, that's what people wanted to do, until you bring them immediate benefits now, which is why it was so important that very early in our days, we would bring people cheap energy when it was windy, cheap energy when it was sunny, cheap energy for an electric car overnight. Anything we could do to demonstrate that the energy transition is beneficial if you use it right. And actually, one of my favorite things, again, you can't do this if you're just a platform provider. But when we started buying wind farms, we put laser display units at the bottom. And then we were so out, like people, there was a thing a few years ago, right? And it's still with a small number of retrograde politicians that, wind farms are bad. So we would just want to be out and proud. And we laser display them, run light shows. We had YouTubers jumping off them with an abseil, not on the road, and so on. So I think all of this is stuff you can do if you're in the sector. And then if you're providing the platform to let others do the same, you can change the sector.
That's really great story and very interesting. And now, of course, you can take the platform globally, which I think we'll touch on in a bit. One question for you, because we do have some of our techUK gets involved in accrediting students and learners coming into tech. And I'm just very interested, Greg, some of those are listening in today or watching today. Is it easier or harder to build a tech company now? If we were to say to these 5,000 people doing Tech Industry Gold courses, you could go and build your own company, easier or harder than it was when you did it?
I think there's a lot of people might worry it's harder because at the moment there's been this massive kind of, as we get higher interest rates, a less certain economy, a kind of a perception of a reduced investor appetite, particularly in the world of tech, and you've seen valuations of very big tech companies falling. But these things are so, what's the word? Kind of fluctuant, very, cyclical. That, for example, if you're starting a tech company today, by the time you need real money, the markets may well have turned. It's like the very first people to SPAC probably did quite, I haven't checked, by the way, probably did okay. Mm. But then when so many other companies followed, sort of valuations collapsed. And so I think almost counter-cyclical behavior, Warren Buffett says, wise investors like it when stock prices fall because there's a chance for a bargain. I think it's probably the same for entrepreneurs.
Right. And so if they were looking at this, is there always a model that says understand the industry you're aiming it at? Or is there a more general thing?
I think understand your customer. Like, I don't think I've ever told this story. So, but I left school when I was 16 to write video games. Before I went, I didn't go to university. But and by the way, I'd love to share what we call tech back then with people now. But when you a whole video game, I'd fit in less memory than a GIF. But but I wrote one game that was honestly, it was the best code I'd ever, fucking brilliant code. It was so well optimized on a 3.5 megahertz Z80. And, but actually the game wasn't any fun to play and it didn't get published. And I'd done all that work and I didn't get paid. And realizing that no one was ever going to see my code, I was incredibly proud of it. No one would ever see that. What they would see is the game. And that really mattered more. And it was the customer experience that mattered vastly more. And I think it's really interesting. So when you said, should you know an industry? The people behind Uber didn't know about cabs. That was probably a good thing, right? We learned about energy as we built our platform. Now, we brought experts in as we went. But to start off with, we built enough platforms, enough industries. We kind of just understood, broadly speaking, how a sector works. And I think it's not that naive thing that says without the assumptions in the industry, you will do better. But it's definitely to say that in most industries, learning about the customer, the fundamentals of the customer, going back to first principles, will enable you to do well. And a couple of examples for me would be, take Uber, actually. Uber, for the first N years of its existence, didn't have the ability to book a cab in advance. Now, absolutely anybody from the cab industry would have said, function number one, book in advance, because without that, you can't go to an airport or a station or a job interview. But of course, from a tech perspective, you know that booking in advance has got an awful lot of failure cases. And so if you want to create a smooth customer experience, dramatically reducing the number of things that can go wrong means that all your effort and your users are getting the experience you wanted. And they only came out of that much, much, much later. And even now, it's one of the less good functions. And so I think that ability, there was an article in McKinsey, the McKinsey Quarterly, I think what it's called, that said, why is tech transformation so difficult? And the subheading, which answered the question, was because the IT function is still taking orders. And I think as a tech business really is that tech people are at the top table. They may be the only people, but they're definitely there. Because instead of having business people saying, this is what we want the tech to do, you have tech people saying, this is what the tech can do. And that's the transformative difference.
That's interesting. I'm definitely making note of that, just here at techUK and how we use tech ourselves. But so switching to sort of look a bit into the future, and before we get into the sort of big picture, Greg, you're well known, and I think everybody can see, very personal, very hands-on. How does that scale? Because I mean, without doing too much stock price changing stuff, clearly the potential for Kraken, for Octopus, and for this whole approach is enormous. How do you scale a personal touch?
So I think tech businesses more than any others, but maybe not actually. Founder-led businesses scale their founders. So if you look at Oracle, it's basically just Larry Ellison writ large, right? And I'm making no judgment, just to say that Apple, the same with Steve Jobs, really, it was Steve Jobs writ large. You scale the magic of the founders. And by the way, that's a lot of people got magic, right? This isn't there's anything special. There's a gazillion people who haven't found a business that are truly magic. But they are different people. So, if you look at almost any scaled up, Weatherspoons scales that bloke with the hair. Tim Martin, thank you. I don't want to be rude, by the way. It's just, and I think if you're going to put your heart and soul in, it is you, and you grow it. Now, one day you can hand it on. Apple did a brilliant job, didn't they, of Tim Cook taking over from Steve. And so, and I think, and we've seen the same with Microsoft, really. So I think you can always hand over. But the essence of the business starts with, what were the founding ideals? What were the founding principles? What were your founding beliefs? And so I think, for us, my co-founders, we had a set of things that we just really wanted to deliver. And the interesting, I don't know how far I'm allowed to say these things, but it's like, that one day your investors, your backers might not want you to do it, or you might not be right for it. And that's totally cool. In that case, someone else takes it forward. But until then, the difference between founders and employed CEOs is an employed CEO is much more likely to say, right, we're changing direction. We used to believe in X, now we believe in Y. Whereas the founders will continuously aim on X. And if that's no longer right, then someone else will run it. And by the way, I'd be totally cool with that,
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. So switching maybe to the broader thing, and you touched on this a little bit, Greg, already, but, everybody's struggling with the cost of living. You've already talked a little bit about, some of the targeted things you can do to help with that. But maybe in their badness, there's some goodness because, with fossil fuel prices and this strange arrangement where the last resort one sets the price for everything, that's really changed the dynamic on renewables versus fossil fuels, isn't it, in terms of the future? As you said, green now looks affordable or even a bargain rather than a problem.
So I should say on that, first of all, that renewables were already cheaper than fossil fuels for generating electricity prior to the crisis, and are getting cheaper every year. And if you use them right, we've got this path to an astonishing future of abundant zero marginal cost, zero carbon energy. And I think by the way, that'll foster whole new industries. For example, we've got a bunch of customers who do indoor farming, and the crops kind of sleep when it's not windy and when it's not sunny. They're totally happy doing that. But in return, you get very, very cheap energy for an energy-intensive business that doesn't use pesticides, doesn't use 99% of the water that goes in the building, leaves in the fruit and veg. And it transforms, instead of air miles for food, it's grown where it's used. That's just one example of the fact that the energy transition isn't a like-for-like replacement. It's a massive societal upgrade opportunity. But I think that was already the case prior to the crisis. I think the crisis is complex. I mean, first of all, I truly wish it wasn't happening. It is absolutely brutal. It's a result of the post-pandemic supply chain and then hugely compounded by the war in Ukraine. And I think that essentially people's energy bills have been weaponized in service of Putin, and the effect on households and on businesses is brutal and completely unfair. People have done nothing wrong, and yet they're losing out. By the way, the beneficiaries are not, it's not, global oil companies. I think I saw a report in Bloomberg yesterday, I think, that excess profits mainly in fossil fuels, also in some forms of electricity generation, will be £170 billion. So we've got you're going to have people who can't afford to heat their homes, and others some companies that have it's not like they planned on these kind of revenues. It's not like they made smart investments. They just happened to be there when Putin pushed the price of their commodity up. And I think this is completely unjust. I think it's also unjust that the exact industry they're in is the one that's given Putin that leverage, and they benefit from it. And it's the one that's destroying our planet. So this isn't to be moralized and say that oil companies are bad or anything like that, but it's to say that the job of governments and society is to kind of right wrongs, and there's a massive wrong there. Kwasi Kwarteng, when he was business secretary, did say Putin was the best salesman, best advert for renewables. And I do think that the conversation about escaping from fossil fuels has got renewed impetus. Yeah. The challenge is that in these times of difficulty, you almost have people saying, look, actually, we just need more gas ourselves and not depend on Russian gas. So there are going to be some perverse outcomes in the short term as people struggle to deal with it. I think, though, I was born in the 70s and was a child in the 70s, and we had fossil fuel crises then that meant that there were power cuts. Definitely now, we've had them periodically ever since. The difference now and then is we do have an alternative, but that alternative is going to create winners and losers. It's better for society, it's better for our planet, it's better for national security, but there will be losers. And being very candid, like people who own gas pipes, own a piece of infrastructure that genuinely shouldn't have a long future. Now, if we're honest about that, we can actually help transition. But the history of business is, Exxon discovered, lots of people discovered it, but Exxon scientists were among the first to absolutely categorically prove in the 1970s the link between burning fossil fuels and climate change. Exxon used that, I've got to be careful here in case there's any legal things that's public. But look, some oil companies are believed to have used that information.
Yeah. You've heard that.
Yeah, to bury.
People have said.
I believe there are documentaries on it on YouTube and on the BBC. I haven't checked myself, but broadly speaking. But so the challenge is societally, when there are going to be losers, when those losers are powerful, when those losers are genuinely important employers and taxpayers, it's harder to drive change than it should be. And what we need is brave governments to both put our arm around those. Today we do need gas and oil. If we stop supplying gas and oil today, in fact, Octopus is probably the second biggest seller of gas in the UK. Right? So we should be really clear that we're on this. But do you see the opportunity to get off gas as an opportunity or a threat? And we need governments to make sure that it's an opportunity for more people and a threat for fewer.
Yeah. So broadening out, one of the things that when you look at governments and what they do they look across the piece enough, Greg? So for example, there's a lot of talk about, wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, so now we don't have renewables. Well, what about batteries?
I'll tell you what, right?
Storage.
Yeah.
Do you Do you get into many conversations about that? Are we behind on batteries and storage?
Well, look, first of all, this is what I spend my days doing, right? First of all, it's amazing how many newspaper commentators are phenomenal experts on the energy system when it comes to the topic of climate change. I'm stunned by their expertise in engineering and physics. But that question about storage, for example, the first thing is usage. The best thing you can do is use it while it's being generated. The more of that we do, the less the gaps matter. Today, we can fill the gaps with gas. Now, it's not ideal, but we should think of, like today, we think of fossil fuel generation electricity as our primary source. And we need to be thinking of wind and solar as our primary source and the gas as the backup. Yeah. But shifting our usage, which takes no effort but reduces costs, very good, then enables us to say that we need less storage at times it's not been used. But at the same time as we're talking about this, I think there were 600,000 electric cars sold in the UK last year. Yeah. It's been roughly doubling year on year. Within a few years, there'll be, the majority of driveways will have an electric car on them. And that electric car will hold enough power for the house it's adjacent to for several days. That will provide an awful lot of our storage needs. So I think the big risk in energy is we think linearly. We just think a lot of the traditional thinking energy is that you want a wind turbine to behave like a coal-fired power plant. So you need to put a massive battery at the bottom of that wind turbine, and then National Grid can be sure they'll get a rectangle. Mm-hmm. And that's just completely the wrong way to think about it. And so we were lucky enough that when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, which was only a couple of years ago, I think, they visited our offices and they spent hours exploring this. And by the way, there's a brilliant video of them explaining the ways we can use wind and solar better, genuinely brilliant explanation of it. But what we did do is we had a big screen showing National Grid's control room mm-hmm. and a traditional mini cab office, because they look the same. Both of them have got a bunch of blokes, and it is mainly, by the way, National Grid is quite a diverse employer, I should reverse that now, but mainly you've got a bunch of people who phone up and dispatch, in one case dispatching cabs, and dispatching power. And then we put that opposite a shot of Uber's, sort of Uber, and sort of some big, it's very hard to show photos of big data, but we showed some big data. And the idea being we need to move from a world where power is managed by people to where it's just algorithmically handled as a complex system, a truly decentralized way, building its way from, taking power from solar panels on a roof and using them as much as you can. And then at the next level, taking it from having batteries at street level and solar farms and wind farms near towns and cities, and then up to the big scale where you might have, wind farms offshore. And then going further than that, Octopus has backed a project called X-Links to build a vast solar farm in Morocco and a 4,000 kilometer cable that will connect it to here. As you stack all those forms of energy and then optimize across them, mm-hmm. this concept is often called firm power, the stuff you can turn on and off. And instead let the computers just deal with the complexity. That world will be dramatically cheaper and cleaner than the one we've got today.
It's fascinating, and it's a sort of follow the sun thing, which has been in tech for ages, hasn't it? So why not? Let me sort of draw to a conclusion my questions to you, maybe with just two variations on a future look, Greg, which is when you look at new technologies, are there any you're particularly looking at, and what would hold you up and what would hold fellow tech-enabled businesses up? Is it skills? Is it digital infrastructure? But so when you look at new technologies, what AI, we've got to have ChatGPT, haven't we, to do everything?
Let's talk about it, haven't we?
But also things like quantum and the whole connectivity space, etc.
Look, we're a tech business, right? We build really, really good digital tech, scalable. I mean, Kraken it runs continuous integration, continuous deployment. So I know 100, 200 releases per day. We take in billions of data points. If you've got a smart meter, several times per day, we'll do a 2-year forecast at the half-hour level for your consumption. If you drive an electric car and we've got the right APIs, we'll be forecasting how much you're going to use it every day. If you've got solar panels, we're working out how much you're going to be generating. Again, every half hour for as long as we can out. Gazillions of different wind forecasts, everything, all of that. Because what you want to be doing continually is optimizing. Let's say that we have 10,000 electric car owners in Cornwall and a bunch of wind farms in Cornwall, and we've got the weather forecast in Cornwall. And it's going to be windy today, then it's going to be not windy for a few days, then it's going to be windy for a few days, right? What we want to do is like work out which cars need today's wind, let all the cars use very little electricity over the next few days, and then fill their boots in a few days' time. Now, all that is best if you can forecast it and forecast it very granularly and do it very locally. The more locally you can do it, the less infrastructure we need, and the easier it is to optimize. And then the more granularly you do it, the more you can be literally matching the exact moments of wind. And you need to forecast ahead, because it would be a great shame if you charge all the batteries tonight and then discover tomorrow was windier. So all of that stuff, and it's a colossal amount of optimization. That's what we call technology and energy today. I think a lot of people think of technology as being, for example, fusion. Fusion would be brilliant, right? Amazing. But we don't need it. We already have all the tech we need for a green energy system, and one that's going to be cheaper than the one we have today. And what we shouldn't do is allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good, and hold off, for example, vast new nuclear power stations or small modular. We just need to get on with it. And then when better stuff comes along, just like when the iPhone launched, it launched with Edge, if I remember rightly, which was, today, if you get an Edge signal, it's you might as well just turn your phone off.
Yeah. And
yet that was what got us going on the smartphone revolution, right? And then we had all the different Gs thereafter. So in the same way with energy, we need to get going with what we've got, optimize it massively, and then when new technology comes on, we'll just plug it into the system. But don't let it be an excuse to wait. And the same goes things like, there's a load of stuff about hydrogen, for example, which I could talk about endlessly. Yeah. 97% of the world's hydrogen today, by the way, is dirty. So before we start talking about clean hydrogen, let's at least clean up what we currently have, and then think about its role in our future energy system. But today, everything from cars to home heating can be run through optimized green electricity.
And inhibitor skills, people?
Last year, we had 82,000 job applications for 888 appointed roles, excluding customer service or operations.
You don't have a skills problem.
Look, and also, I don't want to be blithe about it, but I do think, and forgive me, because this is probably unpopular among some of your members, so we could have a good debate about it, but companies have got a huge responsibility to find, foster, inspire talent.
Yeah.
And, some people in our sector will tell me they can't get skilled. Some companies I've named will tell me they can't get skilled people. And I think it's because they're not creating the right working environment or the right mission. I should very quickly say, I think there's tons of sort of stuff in the press about mission-driven companies. And there's a lot of companies, where they're kind of force-fitting a mission on. It's much better if it's authentic. But more important than that as well is I think there are two dimensions that really, really matter. So one is, what's the mission you're on, of the purpose? The other one is, how enjoyable is the work, right? And so I see for example, there's a lot of NGOs that have got an incredibly important mission.
But they're not very good.
But they're not necessarily, when I speak to people who work in them, they're not always like hugely kind of exciting or fun or interesting or motivating, inspiring organizations, despite they've got amazing purposes. And similarly, by the way, and that's not to criticize any, some are amazing, but there are companies in sectors like gaming where you might argue, some people might say, their purpose is not necessarily the most kind of, edifying, but it can be tremendously fun to work in. And frankly, if you're a data scientist and you're able to look at the data from a game company and do magical things with it, that might be a lot more interesting. Yeah. So I think the real magic employers need to focus on is thinking about how do you get to the top right of that, whatever your sector. But both dimensions are really important. Yeah. And I think that's kind of where, we really work hard to deliver. And I think on the skills thing, I think there's a lot of people actually make it the government's responsibility. But the problem with the government is, on tech, they're always going to be behind the curve, right? So, and that's not to criticize government. It's really, really hard. But, for us, we barely work with government schemes on most things, not because we don't hugely admire and respect what they're trying to achieve, but we need to move faster than that.
That's a really good note to end on. And I think we have an ambition at techUK for our members to be producers rather than consumers of talent. And
well, we should talk.
Yeah, exactly. So look, I did promise I would let a few questions come from the floor and from the internet, and we do have. And I think there's a microphone. The reason you need the microphone is for the people online, of which there are about 500, we think. So the gentleman in the white shirt was first. Do you want to take a couple of questions and answer them? So short question if you can. And
very good. Thank you very much for coming along and speaking. So my name is Dylan Langley. I'm from BAE Systems and I work in government technology. So a bit of a different audience for you, but I'm an enormous fanboy, right? So I kind of get that out there to start with. I'm feeling on board. Curiously, I've spent a bit of time working in smart DCC, and that put me off getting a smart meter until January this year because you end up knowing a little bit too much. But I'm on board now. I'm all over it. I've got a million questions for you, but I'll give you this one, right? So in government, what legislation would you like to see government enact to enable your vision of the future?
Brilliant. You want to take the second question, deal with it, or is it completely radically different, this gentleman?
Following on for that, but yeah, I'm very interested to know how you would use your insights to understand what energy scheme productions and systems can happen. So literally from the legislation, how are you bringing those insights from your systems to advise on what's needed where?
Brilliant. Thank you. So, and they're very connected. So first of all, thank you. And look, smart meters know some stuff, but your ISP knows an awful lot more. It's always my kind of comfort factor, right? But there are two or three things, if I'm allowed to, that I ask government to do. So the first is, currently, if you want to build new electricity generation, you're going to be waiting 7 to 10 years for a grid connection. We desperately need radical overhaul there. We can build a wind farm onshore in engineering in less than a year. Now, of course, we've got to make sure it's where people want it. In return, then we can give them cheaper power. So we need reform of grid connections. And probably, I'd go for contestability, which is if I can't get a connection, I can build my own. A bit like if you build a factory, you build your own road to the motorway. I think the second thing is price signals everywhere. At the moment, we have this bananas world in which when it's windy, everybody's bills subsidize wind farms in Scotland to turn off because we have nowhere to send the wind, nowhere to send the electricity because we don't have the cables. Simultaneously, by the way, for the next 10 years in West London, there's a sort of a restriction on the building of housing, warehouses and data centers because we don't have electricity infrastructure. And we would be building wind farms in the North Sea much faster, but we're not going to have connections until the 2030s. So all of these things, I think, speak to the need for that overhaul of grid connections and also price signals. So at the moment, instead of all of us paying wind farm owners in Scotland to not generate, for example, Scottish people could just have free power when it's windy, all right? But because we have this kind of mentality, a sort of nationalised mentality, there's a rule that it's the same grid price in every location at all times. And that just means you end up with the investment's not going to the right places. We have wasteful content. It's the equivalent of having wine lakes and butter mountains. Yeah. So they're the two things. Price signals everywhere, real time. And by the way, it doesn't mean all consumers, it's not like your electricity will vary in price. It's just that at the back end, we would see these variable prices and we'd be able to build products around that. We'd be able to invest accordingly. Yeah, we drive our incentives, right? And we'd make it easier for people in areas with constraints to get electric cars to suck up when they can, cheaper in Scotland, anyway, and so on. And then, so I guess that probably halfway answers the question you're asking, right? Which is,
there's some great gaps in terms of understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think from our perspective, I got asked at a conference recently, what do I think the energy mix will be in 10 years' time? Like the energy mix is the phrase, how much is going from coal, nuclear, whatever, right? And governments really worry about that. And I don't, because it's all electrons, right? So all it is people need to get access to electrons to run the electrical things. And it's our job to meet those needs. Now, what we should do is make that as green as possible, as quickly as possible. And I think the insights we get are that there's an astonishing ability to shift consumption. When we started the business, all the research said there was virtually no ability to shift consumption. Now, we've proven this time and time again that, you know, you can offer people financial incentives, and those that love bargains will move their dishwasher time. That you can automatically be interfaced with the APIs on batteries and cars to flex all of that. That you can incentivize people to get cars that will discharge into the house or the grid, and so on. Just everywhere we look, there's incredible untapped opportunity to make a renewable world faster and cheaper by flex. You had your hand up as well, didn't you?
Yeah.
We also got online. So. Okay, after you.
Sure. It's kind of similar to the regulation question, but how are you feeling about the current system for price capping, and also the previous one, which was looked upon quite negatively? Yeah.
So we're a contrarian because we believe in a better world. So we're quite like the energy price cap has been a good thing. It's been a good thing for a whole pile of reasons. But the first one is energy pricing is opaque. No normal human knows what a kilowatt hour costs. Yeah. Unless they get an electric car, by the way, in which case they definitely know what it costs. And pretty soon they know what it costs every minute of the day on an Octopus Agile tariff. But the reality is that opacity of pricing meant that it's possible for energy companies traditionally to exist as bloated, lazy entities, overcharging customers, and then offering cheap deals to a small number of people who switch. And what you end up with is a world where a lot of ordinary people are massively ripped. I mean, in the old days, they were paying 50%, even more than that, more than people who switched. And you'd hear quite a lot of commentators say, well, you know, people need to beware, they need to go, you know, take responsibility and be informed. But the reality is, if I go to Tesco to buy flour, I'll probably get a good price. And I'll get a good price because I don't buy flour, I have no idea what it costs. But there are avid bakers who buy a lot of flour. And if they go to Tesco and they see it being expensive, they'll go elsewhere. So Tesco keeps the price of flour down. And in fact, you hear Tesco actually on the radio at the moment talking about what they're doing to keep prices down. But so in most markets where prices are visible, active consumers keep prices down for everyone else. But there are markets, opaque markets like energy, where active consumers get a bargain at the expense of everyone else. And I think fixing that is important. Now, the price cap was a crude and clunky approach, but it did at least end the rip-off. It also, by the way, every large energy company except one have undergone a technology overhaul, which not only brings down operating costs, but is improving products and service. So it's a good thing. I do think it needs reform. And so, you know, there's a bunch of, personally, I think if you tie the price of the cheapest customer to the most expensive with a small, you know, gap, then you harness bargain hunters for everyone's benefit, as we see in markets that deliver better outcomes like supermarkets. The current energy price guarantee, which is keeping prices down, every country's got a form of, every country in Europe has got a form of government intervention, because without that, at one point, energy bills have gone from £1,000 a year typically to 7,000. I mean, just unimaginable. And so it's right the government have kind of helped. The amount of help is about to reduce dramatically, and I think it's going to be a real problem.
Okay. Should we take maybe just one question? Online world, I'm sorry.
Well, in advance, and I apologise to everybody that is online, because we've had a ton of questions, and I'm now being asked by my CEO to pick one. So apologies, but I'm going to go with...
I'll answer really quickly. We'll do two if you want.
Okay, all right. Okay. Greg, great discussion, and thanks for sharing. My question is to know what your moonshot is and how challenging it is. I think that's a great question. They're all good questions, sorry. And then we had one question which Ofgem CEO said on Monday that data is critical to the regulator, but that data sharing between agencies isn't where it should be. How should this be tackled? Because you talked about the importance of data, and not just big data, right? All data is important.
We might be able to do more then, because I go really quickly.
Go.
The closest thing to a moonshot for us, and it's not our project, but we're backing it, I've invested in it, is X-Links, which is the cable to Morocco. Stuff like that has to happen sometime. And it would be amazing if the first one is here in the UK. And Morocco, helping both countries. It's transformative, to be clear. But that would be huge. The second thing on data, look, there's more data in energy than any other sector I've worked in. I used to work in a long time ago at Procter & Gamble, where you put stuff on the shelf and then you don't know who's buying it, you don't know how much they're buying, you get it, it's not real time. The challenge in data is, first of all, challenge in energy, companies are not good at using the data. That's why we need to sort this. Second thing is, there aren't markets. The fact we have to queue up and wait 10 years for a grid connection, the fact there's no price signals is balmy. It's got all this data. We know we can shift consumption, yet Octopus has subsidized the energy system tens of millions, maybe 100 million now, in the ways we've used data to make the system more efficient, but don't benefit from it. So actually, it's a lack of markets, not a lack of data.
We take another online one.
Quick then.
Very quick. In the west of England, like many areas, we have constrained electricity grid. Could or can Kraken be applied as a place-based approach to overcoming this and delivering net zero? There's a lot of talk about place-based approach, so that caught my eye.
The reason I talk about price signals is in an area where there's constraints, essentially the price would go up. We would invest in batteries, for example, or generation, or in moving electric vehicles around. Anything that then takes that higher cost and essentially uses it to put the infrastructure in and bring the prices down.
Okay. We could go on.
I can give you another in that speed.
Oh, okay. All right, talk amongst yourselves. All right, I have lots and lots and lots and lots of questions. Thank you to everybody. Okay, well, this is obviously very key to my heart and very key to our heart. Is the UK businesses and consumers, so citizens, where we should be in terms of tech adoption? And I will add to that, what do we need to do to move us forward?
Yeah, we're definitely not. I think there's a perception that tech is for young people, and markets like energy are, quite rightly, a lot of public bodies quite rightly worry about old and vulnerable people. They forget that 97% of people use the internet. My gran is 98, she'll be 99 this year, and she uses an Android tablet and can manage an awful lot of stuff herself. She's got a very big font size, and she doesn't realize that Google's not a browser. But honestly, it's incredible, the misperception.
Greg, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for coming in, talking to us and the tech community here and the broader number of people that joined in, particularly the ones online. We at techUK are very interested in general. We like to keep the discussion going. So if you've been tweeting, if you've been connecting, keep that going. I might prevail on Greg's team if we assemble something that looks meaty and chunky to actually maybe say to you, what would your perspective on this particular area be?
Yeah, of course.
But I think we've covered a huge amount today, and I thank you for that. We are doing more of these through the year, and the next one is lined up 23rd of March. And then I'll be talking to somebody from NTT, which is the Managing Director, UK and Ireland, Vivek Dagga from there. And I think that, again, another perspective on organizations transforming using tech. So, but Greg, thank you very much for your time. There are, I think, drinks and something outside. So please do stay and network. We will have to let Greg go because he's going to get away to another engagement. But Greg, super. Thanks very much.
Thank you.